is brought to you by Head Start Basketball.
Everything starts with your philosophy as a coach, what you want to teach, those early season practices. What do we want to look like by the first scrimmage or by the first game?
Ty Lawson is the boys basketball varsity head coach at Wilde Lake High School in Columbia, Maryland. Lawson was born and raised in Baltimore. He played 2 seasons of college basketball at Bowie State University before beginning his career as a coach. He loves the game of basketball and has a passion for giving back and teaching the game to the next generation. Coach Lawson's basketball journeys allowed him to learn a lot about himself and the world around him, and how the game of basketball connects people from all walks of life. Hey, Hoopheads, I wanted to take a minute to shout out our partners and friends at Dr. Dish Basketball. Their Dr. Dish shooting machines are undoubtedly the most advanced and user-friendly machines on the market. Learn more at drdishbasketball.com and follow their incredible content at Dr. Dish B-Ball on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Mention the Hoopheads podcast and save an extra $300 on the Dr. Dish Rebel, All-Star, and CT models. Visit drdishbasketball.com for details. That's a great deal, Hoopheads. Get your Dr. Dish shooting machine today.
Hi, I'm Dan Krikorian.
And I'm Patrick Carney. And we're Slapping Glass.
And you're listening to the Hoopheads podcast.
Coaches, Game Changer is making your game film more valuable than ever. New this season to Game Changer, Film Room allows team staff to analyze full game videos, add comments to specific moments, and quickly share feedback with other coaches, team members, or families. The #1 youth sports app automatically skips downtime in the game film, condensing event video into active play so you can focus on the moments that matter. The best part? It's completely free for coaches. Download Game Changer now on iOS or Android and take your coaching to the next level with Film Room on Game Changer. Game Changer. Stream, score, connect. Grab your notebook and a pen before you listen to this episode with Ty Lawson, boys basketball head coach at Wilde Lake High School in Columbia, Maryland. Hello and welcome to the Hoopheads podcast. It's Mike Klinzing here without my co-host Jason Sunkel tonight, but I am pleased to be joined by the head boys basketball coach at Wilde Lake High School in the state of Maryland, Coach Ty Lawson. Ty, welcome to the Hoopheads pod.
Thanks, Coach, for having me on. I appreciate being here.
Excited to have you on. Looking forward to diving into how you built your program there at Wilde Lake, going into your background. Let's start by going back in time to when you were a kid. Tell me a little bit about some of your first experiences with the game of basketball. What made you fall in love with it?
Okay. So I'm in my 30s, early 30s. So I fell in love with the game, around age 4 or 5, just started, playing young, grew up playing locally, recreational teams, AAU, the whole nine, played in school, elementary, middle school, high school. Obviously being in the DMV, a lot of people know the competition is heavy here, so I feel like I, grew up in a great basketball environment. So the love for the game was always there, from an early age. And, just playing into high school, I was, afforded the opportunity to play college basketball, not scholarship wise, but I was a walk-on. So I think I have a unique, experience just from, playing and then getting into coaching, kind of seeing, all sides of the game.
Who was your biggest influence as a young kid that got you involved in sports and basketball?
I'm a junior, I'm Ty Jr. So my dad, Big Ty, he was, I wouldn't say like a local legend or anything like that, but a very involved dad. A lot of kids, grew up looking up to him. He was a role model for not just me, but a lot of other kids, in the area. He introduced me to the game, got me playing. He was my coach, throughout my youth, going all the way up into high school. So, he really did a good job of, preparing me and introducing me to the game.
When you think of yourself and the way that you coach, your coaching style, the way you go about things, what's something that you feel like is a part of you that you got from your dad in terms of his style of coaching and something that you still take with you from him that you're passing along to the guys that you coach today?
I'm cracking a smile because I'm thinking about my mom. She's always reminding me, like, yeah, you act just like him on the sideline. The intensity for sure. Just the passion for the game. My dad had a heart for helping people. And I believe that's like the same thing that he passed along to me. Just outside of the game, just genuinely helping people. Making sure that the players, and their families are doing well on a day-to-day basis. That's really something that he instilled in me. There's, basketball is just a game, but there's, things outside of basketball that are, way more important.
Absolutely. So you kind of came of age in a time before all the trainers and the culture that we have today. So when you think about yourself as, let's say, a middle school, junior high, high school player, what were some of the things beyond playing on your teams and playing AAU basketball? How were you working on your game? What were you doing to get better back in the time when you were a young kid?
So, speaking of my dad, I was fortunate enough to grow up with a basketball hoop, right? So I was always outside, on the driveway or, a neighbor, they would pull their basketball hoop out. And the way our neighborhood was set up, sometimes we would take the courts and set up like a little mini full court. So, the neighborhood kids would get involved and, just always working on my game. Like you said, I didn't have the luxury of having a trainer. So I relied on my passion and just my drive to, really improve myself. And, I just remember, a lot of, early mornings on the driveway, late nights, just getting shots up, working on my game. And, that, eventually gave me the confidence, that I needed to perform.
You remember as a kid putting together a plan of, hey, this is what I want to work on a given day? Or was it more just, I'm hitting the courts and when I'm out there, I'm just kind of improvising as I go through?
It was a lot of improvising because I was a huge NBA fan growing up. So, I watched, NBA on Sundays, was a big thing in my house, so always, watching, the great players and trying to go out on the driveway and do the same thing that they were doing, so that's where a lot of the creativity started for me, just emulating a lot of the greats that I saw.
Who was your guy when you were growing up? Who was your favorite?
Magic Johnson, for sure. Magic Johnson gave me the confidence, as a bigger player to get that rebound and push, and a lot of coaches growing up would give me, that compliment. And I always, felt like this was my biggest compliment when coaches would, talk about my passing. I love getting my teammates involved and creating for others. So that was always something that I like to do on the court.
That's awesome because I always think about this was maybe, and I always knew this about myself, but it crystallized for me like 3 years ago. I was sitting in the stands watching a game with my daughter, and we were at a high school game, and some kid out on the floor threw a great pass. And I was like, oh man, that's a great pass. And my daughter, who was like 12 at the time, she turns to me and she looks and she goes, Dad, the only thing you ever get excited about when you're watching a basketball game is a great pass. You don't get excited about anything else. It's only a pass. I'm like, yeah, you're right. You're 100% right. And I think that kind of reflects who I think I am as a basketball coach and what I was as a basketball player. And I'm guessing when you're coaching your team that one of those things that you're always preaching, just again, from listening to you talk and telling that story is, let's make the extra pass. Let's play together as a team. I'm guessing that that's something that is really important to you as a coach.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's one of our staple drills, that we do at Wilde Lake. I'm sure a lot of coaches, out there know about it. One more passing, some type of, passing and shooting drill where, we're really emphasizing making the next pass, really, just emphasizing getting your teammates involved. So yeah, that's definitely something that I try to emphasize, on a daily basis.
Tell me a little bit about your high school playing experience and maybe share your favorite memory or just what you remember from that time of your life.
Sure. So, I played at a school called Western Tech in Baltimore County. We weren't really that known for, our sports or anything. We were more academic school. So, the basketball, I wouldn't say that, we were the best team. We definitely weren't that bad, but, my playing experience, it was more fun in high school, like I was, all about, playing with my friends, playing with guys. I mean, some of those guys, they don't play now. And, so thinking about like, that was my only opportunity to play with some of those guys. And, we made good memories. I'm still in contact with a few of them. So, I believe that's what high school basketball is, truly about, especially when you're not as competitive as some of the schools or some of the teams that you're going against, really, making those memories and, bonding with, guys. So, my high school experience was really good. I actually, I share a story. I'm not Michael Jordan by any stretch of the imagination, but I also got cut my freshman year, so as a high school coach that has to make cuts, that's one thing that I share with kids. Don't get discouraged, when we tell you that, you didn't necessarily do enough to make the team this year, just stay, working and, anything can happen in the future. So I did end up playing 3 years, and then ended up, playing, at the college level. But as you said, I'm sure we'll, get into that.
Well, it's a great lesson, I think, whenever you can have something that you can share, right, as a coach, an experience that you went through at a similar age to the players that you're coaching. And then you can say, hey, I understand what you're going through. I understand what you're feeling. I went through this exact same thing, especially, let's put it this way, especially when it's a negative, right? Nobody wants to hear about the good old days and the coach talking about, our team back in the day, we did this and that. So players will tune you out fast when you're talking about how great things were and how good your teams were and all that stuff. But on the other hand, when you're talking about something that was in the moment, a negative or a tough situation or a challenge, I think players, at least in my experience, I found them to be much more open to listening to those kinds of stories. And I'm sure that when you're talking to a kid who you've had to cut, which we all know, look, right, as a coach, that's one of the most difficult parts of being a high school coach is telling a kid, hey, this year, your dream's going to have to be postponed another year. You're not going to be big. Nobody likes to have those conversations. But when you have that personal story that you can share with the kid, that's impactful because now they can look at you as an example of, hey, this happened to me and I was able to bounce back and put some work in. And now look, I ended up making the team for the next 3 years. And so that's something that I'm sure when those kids hear that from you, I'm sure they feel value in that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I'm thinking of a kid right now. Last year he didn't make the team as a freshman, but he worked on his game and he made it as a sophomore. And I remember I was the one that had the conversation with him because, here in Maryland, in Howard County in particular, we don't really do lists when we cut kids. We have conversations with them. So, I told him, that he didn't do, enough to make the team last year, but we also give, positive feedback in terms of these are the things you need to work on that, we think that you can improve in order to improve your chances of making the team. And it was a good thing that he didn't take anything, personal in terms of, oh, I'm not, liking the coach's feedback. I'm not going to listen to what they're saying. He actually took what we told him, he worked on it, and he made the team. So I was, really proud of him. And to your point, that's a kid, taking what we're telling them, applying it. It's actual relatable information. It's not like I'm telling them, all the glorious things. I told them, I had the same conversation told to me, when I was your age. So it's definitely a good thing when the kids, can relate to a lot of the experiences.
Absolutely. When you were playing as a high school player, was coaching at all on your radar while you were playing? Or was it something that came about later on as your basketball career as a player started to come to an end? In other words, I always say that there's two paths, right, to coaching. One is the kid who's 8 years old and is drawing plays up on the napkin and coaching his buddies and always kind of has been a coach. And then there's the other guy who is just a player. And all of a sudden their career ends. They look around, they're like, what? Basketball's over? Well, now what am I going to do? Now I got to coach. So I don't know if either one of those scenarios fits you better than the other one.
Oh yeah, that was definitely me, the latter, I didn't grow up thinking that I would ever be a coach. My dream was to always stay on the playing side. Even when I first got into coaching, I kind of wanted to tailor my demographic towards the training side because I saw that that's kind of where the game was going. And I also thought that was like my way of staying connected to the game, like staying on the floor. But I just naturally got into coaching. You know, you mentioned Coach Julian Allen. He introduced me to his AAU team here in Baltimore. So I started helping him on the AAU side for a few summers, and got into the school side of things once I actually started working on going back to school myself. So
start coaching while you mentioned we'll talk about your college experience here in a second, but did you start working AAU like in the summers while you were in college, or was this after you were done with college?
This was after I was done with college. When I was still playing in college, the plan was to still play. We had a few guys from our team that ended up landing a few, nice deals with some agents and ended up playing overseas. That wasn't my path, but, similar to what you were saying, just when I looked around and, saw like, wow, this is the end of the playing side, but I'm not personally done with my basketball journey. I had to find something to do. So coaching to me, like, kind of was the next best thing to still keep me involved, but not necessarily, like as involved as I was obviously when I was playing.
Understood. All right, let's walk it back to your college experience. Tell me a little bit about how you get to that walk-on experience and then what it's like for you. I know that there's guys, depending upon the program, I've heard great things from guys who have been walk-ons, and I've heard horror stories from guys who have been walk-ons, depending upon what your program's like, depending upon what the guys on your team are like. So just walk me through your experience, how you got the opportunity, and then what it was like for you.
So in high school, I wasn't the best player on our team by any stretch, right? We had a guy who ended up playing Division II. We actually ended up playing in the same conference. When I was a walk-on, he was in the same conference as me. So we ended up playing against each other in college. But he was like the main guy on our high school team that was like featured, and, the coach like ran a lot of the stuff through him. I mean, and no shade whatsoever, because he was a great player, and he's, still probably good, to this day. But my experience as far as like networking and recruiting and all of that stuff, I didn't have any of that. My dad also, like, he wasn't really, exposed to that world. So he didn't necessarily know outside of what the school was doing for me, how to network and do all of those things kind of in the background. So graduating high school as a senior, my playing career could have been over at that time. So I ended up applying to a few schools locally. As I've mentioned, I'm from Baltimore, so I applied to Bowie State University. It was really important for me at the time to get away from Baltimore, but not necessarily go somewhere too far that would have like a financial burden on my family. So Bowie State was a great option for me. I had heard good things about the school. So when I visited the school and then the campus, I just kind of liked what I saw and, thought I saw myself on the campus, and that's what I tell a lot of my guys, when they're going on visits and stuff. You have to visualize yourself in these places. And if you don't feel comfortable, then, that tells you a lot. So I felt comfortable at Bowie, ended up making a decision to go there. Not, like signing or anything, obviously, because I didn't have any scholarships. So, my story is pretty unique. People that know me personally know about my connection to music. I've always had a love for music and, produce beats and, songs and things like that. So, my plan, if, basketball didn't work out, I always had dreams of working in the music industry, as a music producer. So Bowie State had a degree program for music technology. They were one of the only schools in Maryland at the time that had that as a degree program. So me as a, music lover, I'm like, that's a no-brainer. I want to work in the music industry and I can get a college degree in it. Like, that sounds kind of cool, right? So that was my path. I had a few friends, when I would come back home to Baltimore for the summer, would, kind of nudge me and, hey, like, what's up with the ball? Or like, what are you doing? I'm 6'9", by the way. So like a lot of people are like, you're just going to waste that height. You're just going to waste like that. You're going to waste that size. Like, what are you doing? So when I graduated high school, I was only 6'6", but I had another growth spurt my freshman year of college. I went from 6'6" to 6'8". So coming home for the summers, my guys are like, "What are you doing?" So that workout process started with a few of my friends that were just kind of encouraging me, like, "Ty, like there's no way you can just not do anything basketball related ever again." So I'll give a lot of my friends that credit, for pushing me and kind of getting me back in the weight room. And the summer of 2010 was when, they, really just started, helping me out. A lot of my guys would come to the gym with me, and, we had 5 a.m. sessions in the summertime, so to your point earlier about, just going out, working on my game by myself, no trainer. My trainers were my friends. We would go to the gym. They would lift with me. They would rebound for me. They helped me kind of get back in basketball shape. And I remember calling the assistant coach from Bowie State because, schools have, the phone numbers and all of that stuff on their website. So I go on Bowie's, athletic website. I called the assistant coach. Didn't get an answer, left a voicemail. I told him, my name's Ty Lawson. I want to try out for the team. And by the way, I'm 6'8", so.
It always helps. That always helps.
For sure. So, didn't call me back immediately, but he did call me back. And I remember, like it was yesterday, he was like, "Is this Ty Lawson?" I'm like, "Yes, sir." He's like, "Are you really 6'8"? I said, "Yes, sir." So, it gave me an opportunity to come, try out, and, the rest was history. I played my way onto the team, through a series of, workouts and open runs. And by the end of that summer, the coach, they told me, "We don't have a scholarship for you. We don't have any type of anything, but we have a locker for you." I said, "That's good enough." So my experience as a walk-on, was amazing. I played my way onto a team with a group of guys that accepted me. Some of the guys were on scholarships. Some of the guys, were just students, just like me, who played, high school basketball, but were good enough to play at the Division II level. Bowie State is in the CIAA conference. For those that don't know, that is a very talented conference and on the Division II level. On a lot of East Coast schools, Bowie State and Lincoln University are actually like the furthest northern schools. A lot of the schools are located in Virginia and North Carolina. So it was a great experience, traveling and, just being able to say I'm a college basketball player. That was always my dream growing up, so being able to have that experience and earning that experience, was a really unique opportunity for me and something that I don't take for granted to this day.
Story. And I think it's one that when you hear guys like yourself talk about just the fact that you get done playing as a high school player and your opportunities are limited, not necessarily because of your ability, but simply because of the opportunity. I think it was interesting to hear you say that your father didn't know a ton about what that recruiting process was like, and maybe your high school coach didn't know a ton about it. I think now, look, I'm a lot older than you, so you're in your early 30s, man. I'm in my mid 50s. So back when I was going to school, we knew nothing about the recruiting process, and so I made a ton of mistakes and ended up getting lucky and getting an opportunity to play college basketball. But to your point, my parents didn't really know much about the recruiting process. My high school coach didn't. So consequently, back in the day, pre-internet, there's no real way to find out anything the way that you can find it out today. And so you kind of end up sometimes in this world of, well, I think I might be able to have an opportunity, or I think I'm good enough to deserve an opportunity somewhere, but how do I find and make that connection? So I always find stories like yours to be inspiring, that somebody just didn't give up and you just kept looking for a way. How can I stay involved in the game? And then to hear you talk about the fact that you're looking back so fondly on your experience with the program, the guys that were playing, scholarship guys, non-scholarship guys, your coaching staff. What's the relationship like, or what was it like at the time? What does it continue to be like with those guys that coached you at Bowie State? Obviously, as you get into coaching, you probably look back on that relationship and just the way that they did things a little bit differently, because now I'm sure you're trying to take some coaching knowledge from that experience, whereas in the moment you were just trying to play.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. It's so funny you mentioned that because I think back to the early days of my coaching experience. A lot of the things that I did literally mirrored the things that I received when I was playing at Bowie. I felt like that was like my closest experience to high level basketball, right? So a lot of the things that we did on a day-to-day basis, I carried over into the way I run the program at Wilde Lake, because we had success, in the 2 years that I played on the team. We went to our conference tournament, which was huge. This was before the Charlotte Hornets became the Hornets again. This is when they were still the Bobcats. So I played on the NBA arena, that's once in a lifetime experience, So that was really cool. And then we ended up, not a lot of people know that the NCAA Division II national tournament is set up similarly to the Division I tournament. So, we had a selection Sunday process, sitting down trying to figure out where we're going. And, again, that was a really cool experience. My coaches, to this day, I'm still connected to them. The head coach, Darryl Brooks, is still the head coach of Bowie State. One of my former players or teammates is his associate head coach now. So we still have that connection. So yes, I'm definitely still connected to a lot of my teammates, because that was a really good experience, and at that age, you're a lot of the experiences that you're having, you're going through similar things just in life in general. So those guys, and those relationships and those friendships really carried over into adulthood now, which I'm very fortunate for.
How soon after that experience, when you leave Bowie State and graduate, how soon after that did you start getting involved with AAU with Julian and getting involved on the coaching side of it? How long after it was that?
So after, because I as I mentioned, I trying to, work in the music industry. So, doing the music thing for about 2 years before, that love for the game just doesn't go away, no matter, how closely connected you are to it, So,
Absolutely.
I'm kind of knee deep into the music thing, but I'm still, I'm still playing, myself, like playing pickup locally, things like that. So that's actually how I met Julian, playing pickup one day at a gym. I noticed he had on a pair of shorts that said Bowie State University. And I'm thinking to myself, like, where did he get those shorts from? Like, I didn't see, I just graduated from there. I didn't see this guy on campus. And he was pretty good in the pickup game. Like, Julian could play. So, we were on opposite teams and, just through small talk, we had mutual friends at Bowie and, just the connection was genuine from day one. Julian's one of my brothers. I talk to him, every other week, still to this day. He's the one that kind of got me into coaching on the AAU side. Again, I had no, thoughts about coaching. I was still in play mode and, being into the music side of things. I wasn't thinking about coaching at all. But when Julian, gave me that opportunity to help him out, I just developed a love for, leading and teaching. And I really got into the X's and O's side of the game. Like, I think like just drawing up plays and just different concepts and different philosophies. That's what really got me into, the coaching side of things. So it was a really cool experience.
It's funny how when you look at basketball from a player standpoint, right? So often you're looking at, what do I have to do? What does my performance have to look like? What do I have to do to earn more minutes? Or what do I have to do to be able to play a bigger role? And yeah, you also are focused on helping your team win, but there is a lot of, and I don't think selfish is the right word, but there is a lot of you looking at your own performance. And then when you start thinking about, okay, now when you become a coach, all of a sudden everything flips in that, not that you're not trying to develop individual players, because certainly you are, but ultimately every decision you make is no longer based on what's good for me as a player. It's what's good for the team. And I think it's interesting to hear you just talk about sort of that mindset flip. And then also thinking about like the X's and O's side of it, where again, as a player, you're kind of focused in on what's my role? What do I have to do? As opposed to as a coach, you're seeing that whole picture. So as you started to dive into X's and O's, where did you go or who did you talk to? What kind of information were you looking at? Were you watching YouTube videos? Are you going to trying to get to coaches clinics? Are you grabbing the the old DVDs? How are you getting the X's and O? How are you grabbing that X's and O knowledge at that time?
Yeah. So, I've always been like somewhat of like a basketball hoarder, right? So like anything that I feel like is like good or like just resourceful, anything that I think is positive and I can use again in the future, I'm going to stash it somewhere and I'm going to keep it, right? So fortunately for me, I kept and now I'm going to kind of age myself. I know you said you're a little older, but you're not old, Coach. You're not old. But so a paper playbook of my plays from Bowie State that I kept. They gave us a binder. So at the beginning of the season, they had a binder for us and it had all of my plays, like different concepts, different things. Obviously, we built on it as the season, grew, but I still had that. So just going through all of the stuff that I used to go through, as a player. And to your point about the X's and O's, it was interesting because as a player, you're sitting on the sideline and you're in the huddle and the coach is drawing up the play. You may be looking at the whole board, but you're looking at your X, like what you're doing, like what you're supposed to be doing. So You're not worried about all the other X's and O's. Like coach told me to cut here. He told me to do this. Like that's what I'm going to do. Right. So seeing those old plays, but then now that I'm a coach and I'm not just focused on my X, looking at those things and it's like, oh man, like we used to do some slick stuff. Like we used to do some cool things like offensively, like this double screen or this backdoor, like just really thinking about, man, like, and to think a lot of that was based on because of the personnel we had. So then that was another connection, like, oh, coach chose these offensive concepts because of the players that he had. And it made sense thinking about some of my teammates, like, oh, okay, I see why he had this double stagger play in for him because he's going to knock that shot down every time, So just things like that. And really thinking about how I wanted to develop as a coach, that was at a time where this is around like 2015, 2016, where a lot of the basketball world had fell in love with the Spurs and the way that they were playing. So team basketball was like a really big thing at the time, just motion offense and, just fluid movement and flow. And you hear that buzzword pace all the time, right? Just the efficiency that they were playing with. A lot of coaches and a lot of teams try to, mimic that. And as a coach that just always loved motion and all of that kind of things, that's something that I really tried to model, my coaching after, so that's kind of where it started.
Yeah, I think we all start right with the coaches that we played for. I always tell the story that I played for one high school coach and I played for one college coach. So when I started coaching, my entire repertoire of drills and plays and offense and defense, it was what those two guys did. That was all I knew. I didn't know anything else. And so as you go on and you become more experienced, you start to realize that, those guys are pretty good, but there's a lot more basketball out there and many different ways to do the same thing. And so you start to expand your knowledge. But I think anybody who plays, you oftentimes just start out with, well, this is what we did when I was playing. And so this is what my teams are going to do until you start to really dive into some of the stuff and expand your own knowledge of what you're doing. Yeah, so absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about the experience because obviously a big part of the coaching is what we just talked about, the X's and O's and building your knowledge base and all those things. But another huge part of coaching is you got to love your players, you got to love the kids, and you got to love that interaction. So clearly on the AAU side of things, when you get started with Julian, tell me a little bit about your experiences. Forget about the X's and O's and the basketball learning piece of it, but just what was it like for you initially going from, hey, I don't know if this coaching thing, what it's all about, to all of a sudden, boom, you're standing in front of a group of 10 kids and you got to start coaching them. What are those interactions like? What did you love about just working with the kids?
Oh man, I think that was the thing that actually made me fall in love with the coaching side of it, right? I mean, aside from my passion for basketball, I like to think I have a passion for people, and I'm just really big on relationships. I'm no Einstein. I'm not a genius by any stretch. I don't call myself, I don't like to think of myself as a know-it-all. So when it comes to actual like skills, relationship building is one thing that I'm very confident that I have the ability to do. So when it just comes to connecting to people, just building, those relationships, those connections, it was just a genuine experience because I'm putting myself back into those kids' shoes, just remembering what it was like to have a coach that cared, the AAU side of things, not a lot of people know just the financial impact that it has on, certain programs and certain, organizations and, communities. It's really important, for the coaches to have those relationships with the families and with the players. So, coming from the area that we were coming from and working with those kids, it was really important for Julian and I to, just really just throw ourselves into the whole experience. And I'll give Julian a lot of credit because he was already doing it. So to see him and the level of commitment that he had to those kids and the genuine connection that he had, those kids would run through a wall for him, and that's the type of, player that any coach would love to have, and he had a whole program of kids like that. So it was really inspiring.
What do you think when you consider your relationships and how you build them, whether you're talking about back in the day with your AAU kids or you're talking about the kids that you're coaching now? What do you think are the keys for you to build a good relationship with the kids? I know one of the things that you talked about is commitment, and I always think that that's a huge part of a kid having respect for a coach and knowing that, hey, this coach, like, he wants me to be there, but guess what? He's there even more than I am. And I think that's a big piece of it. So beyond that, you can maybe expound on that if you want to, but just what do you think are the keys for you to building a good relationship with a kid?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say, to your point about the commitment, those kids saw Julian every day. So that was inspiring for me. The fact that he gave his word and he was committed to being there, and it was really important for those kids to see that because, there were, some people in their family that weren't as committed to them as Julian was, right? So to see him showing up consistently for them time after time, a lot of experiences, some of them, traveling for the first time, out of the state of Maryland, their families trusting us, to do that for them, to be those role models for them. So the commitment part is definitely important. But I would say, like to the point we were, mentioned earlier, just those genuine experiences, right? I'm not like a gatekeeper when it comes to information or my experiences. So I'm very open and honest with the kids about things that I've been through because I'm not a perfect person, right? So when they see that, oh, coach isn't talking down to me, like he's just talking about things that he's been through because he's relating the same experiences I'm going through as a kid, that's where those connections start. And when the kids see that you genuinely care and it's not just talk, I think that goes a long way with them as well.
High school and middle school basketball program directors, listen closely. Coaches are expected to do far more than just coach. You know this. It doesn't matter if you're doing the coaching yourself or you have a full staff of coaches with you. You know very well that coaches handle scheduling, academic issues, parent communication, leadership development, and even mental health concerns for athletes. A lot to deal with. And when coaches are stretched too thin, it impacts the development of athletes, team morale, and the overall success of the program. There are several ways to prevent you or your coaches from feeling overwhelmed. However, I'll tell you one of our favorite ways to keep coaches firing on all cylinders, and that's athlete-driven accountability and organization. Instead of coaches constantly reminding players about assignments, grades, and practice schedules, the programs at Playmaker Planner put the responsibility back on the athletes. By tracking their own academics, goals, and commitments, student athletes become more self-sufficient, which of course allows the coach to focus on what they love doing most, coaching. Let's find out if the programs from Playmaker Planner can be a complement to what you're already doing. Visit playmakerplanner.com/stop is this for you to find out more. How long into that AAU experience with Julian were you when you started to look around and go, man, I think this coaching thing might be something that I want to do on a more, I don't know, serious is maybe the wrong word, but on a more permanent basis for your career, as opposed to I'm just going to kind of dabble in AAU coaching? Was there a light bulb moment, or was it a slow burn to get to that point?
It was a slow burn that turned into a light bulb moment, if that makes sense, right? Like
It does.
so like the slow burn was me still figuring out if this was something that I personally wanted to take serious. So we had a summer where, we were pretty successful. We had some good teams and we had some good kids. And there was a tournament that we went to where there was a gentleman that saw us playing, and he just fell in love with us and, our program and our coaching style and just how committed we were to the kids. And that opportunity allowed Julian to get into some other things. So it was kind of like that was the light bulb moment. Like people actually believe in us and think that like not just me, but like the whole thing. Like, so that was me really thinking like, oh man, like what if I had an opportunity to do something like this? So it also, like, Julian, again, he kind of introduced me to the school side of things because he was already doing it at a high school in Howard County, which is the rival school of the school that I coach at now, funny enough. So, but yeah, that's what kind of introduced me to that process. And I do have a child, so, getting into that, getting into the school side of things, when I became a parent, I was looking for a job, so the school side of things, becoming a teacher allowed me to get into the school side and coaching. So I actually do work at Wilde Lake High School as well. And, I think that definitely helps, to your point about the relationships. The kids see me every day. I'm in the hallways, I'm with them, at events and things like that. So I think that's definitely a huge part of, allowing me to, build those connections because the kids see me all the time.
Yeah, being in the school, I always feel like is a huge advantage. And I know there are a lot of high school coaches that do a great job that aren't in the school, but I do know that when you're in the school, it does afford you the opportunity to do what you just described, right? You can have these touch points with kids all through the day. You can pop into their lunch period. They can stop by and stick their head in the door and all those things. I know for me, at the beginning of my career, I started out and I was an assistant varsity basketball coach, and I taught at the elementary school. And our elementary school was literally across the parking lot. So it was like a 1 minute walk.
Yeah.
And at the same time, our high school varsity coach and our JV coach both taught at the high school. And so there would be times where, and again, I'm literally 75 yards away, maybe, from the building, but I was always the last person to know if there was a practice change or the bus was coming a little bit earlier or a kid was absent or whatever. And I'm right there. I'm not working some other job and having to drive in. I'm literally right there. And I still felt like there were times where I was disconnected. And so I've always felt that the opportunity to be in the building just gives you it just allows you to be so much more connected to your players on a day-to-day basis. Because, right, we always talk about when you're building a relationship with a kid that, yeah, you build it through basketball and you see them on the practice floor and you see them at games, but so much of that relationship is also built in the time that you see them off the floor. And so when you're in the building, you just get so many more opportunities to be able to share that time with those kids. So let me ask you a question to jump back just for a second. When you realized, hey, I might want to start going the school route, and obviously you're been working and doing your music and you're coaching AAU and that kind of thing. So what steps did you have to take to bridge that connection to allow you to get back and to be able to work in a school setting?
So it's funny enough, and I'm sure a lot of guys and, coaches have similar experiences, especially when they get into the school side. So before I got my actual teaching job, I started as a substitute teacher, right? So, just started as a sub and just being in the building. I'll never forget the first day I was a JV coach. That's how I got started on the school side. So, started as a JV coach, and this is when I didn't work in the building. So I didn't work in the building, and at the end of the season, they, I was afforded the opportunity to start working in the building after the season. So I started in the building, and the guys were there, Coach, what are you doing here? I'm like, I work here now, So yeah, it was an eye-opening experience on both sides because
Right.
honestly, early on, that is something that I took for granted. Just me being me and my belief and my confidence in myself. I do, believe that I have the ability to, connect regardless of where I'm at, right? But when I started working in the building and seeing how the kids' behaviors and just how their responses started to change, going from texting them and calling them every other day to seeing them on a daily basis, the interactions are different now, and that's not something that I, thought about going into it, but it's something that I use to my advantage, early on in my career, as you mentioned. And, that's something that now to this day, I don't take for granted. And I see that, a lot of schools prefer their coaches to, work in the buildings if that's a possibility. Because to your point, that doesn't have to be like a necessary thing because there are a lot of coaches that are successful without working in the buildings that, they coach at. But for me personally, being able to see my players every day, it helps, right? Because if I wasn't working in the building and a young man walks into practice and he has his head down and he's all, he's looking like he's not ready to practice. If I didn't work in the building, it would be harder for me to figure out why that's happening. But when my players walk into practice, I know exactly why they're acting the way they're acting. I can go talk to the teacher down the hall, or I probably already received the email about it, right? So, it's definitely advantages to, being in the building that I coach at. For sure.
All right, take us through the chronology of the jobs that you've had on the school side that led you to the opportunity at Wilde Lakes.
Okay. For me, it's been pretty straightforward. Fortunate enough for me, my teaching experience has only been in the special ed world. So becoming a special ed teacher allowed me to, get a job in the building right away. And I started working at Wilde Lake in 2022. So my first year working in the building as a teacher, I wasn't involved with the basketball program at all. They had a former coach who was a player at Wilde Lake. And he stepped down, he stepped out of the role, and, they were, looking, to, who to pass the mantle on to. And it was just a timing thing. And I was very blessed. That was a clear example of right place, right time. I was, in the right opportunity, and, when they asked me to, come on board, and it was a no-brainer for me. At the time, I had some things going on outside of the building, just outside of basketball that I was still trying to, get straight. But once those things, happened and, the situation was still there for me to coach, I, starting as a JV coach and the trajectory, going upward, that was the next step, becoming a varsity coach. So that was something that I definitely didn't want to let the opportunity slip by. So, took that and, here we are 2 years later.
All right. So when you take the job and you think back from where you are today to the day you got the job or the days leading up to the job, when you think about what your vision was for the program and how you were going to get it to where you want it to go, how has that been similar or different to what's actually happened? So in other words, your vision, your plan, what did that look like? And then how has what's actually transpired been different from what you maybe thought it was going into it?
Okay. So I mentioned earlier that I work and I work and coach at the rival school that I started at. So when Julian was still here in Maryland, he was coaching at that same school. And when he was the JV coach and I was just helping him out, a lot of that was just me, just figuring out, all right, if I ever get this opportunity, what would I do? Right. That came quick because Julian accepted another job and moved into his role. So when I became the JV head coach, that was really my first time leading and having to do a lot of things, making adjustments. To your point about having a plan. Okay, I have a plan. Now this plan is not working. Like we got to do something else. So, and when I was in that role, being the JV head coach, I was a varsity assistant coach. So, sitting on the sidelines during varsity games, and at the time, our school was known for having some really good talent. So, those games are always exciting, and being able to see, why the coach made certain decisions and certain calls and the rotations for the substitutions, just all of those things. And when I got the opportunity to, become a head coach at Wilde Lake, fortunate enough for me, I was already a coach in the county for the last few years, in various roles. So being a head coach now, I was I wouldn't say I was prepared, but I had a general idea of how I wanted to start. And, and yeah, that definitely did not go how I had it in my head for sure.
All right. So give me one thing that you thought, hey, I'm going to be able to do it this way. This is what it's going to look like. I know that this is going to go smoothly. And it ended up going a completely different direction than maybe what you thought.
Man. So, to the, point that we were making earlier about what did we, take into our coaching career at Bowie, we were a fast-paced team. Like we played up and down, we were a transition team. So, when I first started coaching with Julian, it was the same thing. We pride ourselves, everything starts in transition with us. We like to play fast if possible. So, that was my first philosophy. Like, regardless of what team I have, I'm going to get them in shape. We're going to play fast. We're going to get up and down. And that wasn't the case when we first started. And I learned pretty early, like, you have to adjust to the style and play of your team if you want to be successful. Every coach has different philosophies, right? But me personally, I don't like to think of myself as a system coach. I don't have a system. My system adapts year to year based on the players that I have, right? So, one year we may not have the talent to play up and down. And then the next year we may be able to do that a little bit more. Not necessarily that being our main style, but, I do think that, my system and my, style of play definitely adapts. And, I try to, meet figure out what my players do best and then, bring that out to the best of their abilities if possible.
What time of year did you get the job? Did you get it in the spring where you had an entire off season to prepare? Or did you get the job? You got the job in the fall right before you started?
Yeah.
Of course.
It's crazy, like I didn't have any time to prepare. Like I got the job. So tryouts, I'm not sure how it is in other states, but in Maryland, November 15th, that's the start of the winter season. So I got hired maybe the last week of October, and I only had a few weeks to get ready for tryouts, to get just all of that. So going back to, me being that hoarder, I had to go into my stash and figure out like, all right, what am I going to pull out? Like, what are we going to do? But thankfully, I had, coaches, who previously were involved in the program who, helped my transition into the head coaching role. It wasn't a smooth, seamless transition. Definitely were some bumps in the road, but they helped me bridge that gap. So I'm definitely thankful for them as well.
What do you remember about your first conversations with the guys on the team as you take over? Did you have individual meetings with guys? Did you get together as a whole team? How'd you sort of introduce, hey, here's what I'm going to be all about. Here's what our program's going to be all about.
So it's, man, just thinking back on all this, it's just crazy thinking how I got here now, because it wasn't that long ago and it feels like yesterday. So the team that I took over, they had just went to the regional uh, finals the year before I took over. So there were extremely high expectations for that team and that group. And, I just came in, telling the guys, I'm the type of coach where I really don't try to change players, right? If that makes sense. I try to do my best to encourage them and give them feedback based on what I think they need to improve on. But I'm not a forceful, pushy coach, if that makes sense. So what I try to do with the guys, when it comes to relationship building, is just honesty. Like when I'm having those individual meetings, here's what I see, for you. Here's how I plan on using you. But also, what are things that you're comfortable doing? What are things that you aren't comfortable doing? That way, I know when I'm game planning and we're putting these strategies together, best to use you based on a two-way conversation, right? It's not just me talking to them and telling them what I want them to do. I want their feedback as well. I want to know what they're comfortable doing, what they have experience doing, right? Film doesn't lie though. So, I can always just watch and see like, well, you say you're a great corner shooter, but you're over 20, right? Right. So we're not going to use you in that role, right? But, I do think it is important to get that feedback from the players because to your point about the commitment and just the connection, I do think that that's important for players. When you're getting that feedback from them, when they know that you actually care, coach is actually going to apply this. Like he's asking me and he's actually going to put me in that position. That's when the genuine connection, grows from there.
Absolutely. Getting a feel for your players, especially as a first year head coach, right? And when you're getting the job so late, you're trying to get an idea of, okay, can I go back and watch film of these guys playing in previous years? Can I talk to them and figure things out? And then obviously as you get out on the floor with them a little bit, you start to get a feel for what they're all about. Talk to me a little bit about your practice planning process. So when you're sitting down and you're trying to plan a practice, what does that look like for you? Are you doing it pen and paper? Are you on the computer? Are you what's your process for planning a practice?
All over the place, coach. I'm all over the place. Like it may start with a pen and a paper. It may start that might transfer over to the computer and I'm typing some stuff. But by the time practice starts and I print out that I've typed up, it's finally organized and all of that. But that's an interesting question because it's changed, in my short, time, being a head varsity coach, that is, right? Because this was my first time in that role of actually planning practices. That is one of the most, if not the most important part of coaching that I tell, younger coaches that, reach out to me now and, talk to other coaches. Your practice plan is everything, and for me, not plans. So, I'll be honest, as a JV head coach, that was me when I was close, more closely connected to my playing experience. So I'm coming into practice like we're just going to do practice the same way I did as a player, right? Like just from memory and all of the things. I remember the first time I ever did the shell drill, and I'm getting mad at the kids because they don't know how to do it. But I'm teaching them how to do it. I'm just remembering it from my playing experience. And somebody had to, like, you're the coach. You got to teach them how to do it. Oh yeah, that is true. So, getting into, the varsity side of things, everything starts with, your philosophy as a coach, what you want to teach. Those early, season practices we're trying to, get, drill home what we want to what do we want to look like by the first scrimmage or by the first game? What do we want to be able to do? Obviously, it's not going to look the same, come later in the season, come playoff time, but what is our foundation? What is our base? So a lot of those early practices or those plans are, related to just the building blocks that, we're trying to emphasize as a program. And, that changes throughout the season based on, the opponents that we're playing and the things that we're trying to slowly, teach them. We don't just pile on everything on day one and expect them to know it and just roll the balls out and we slowly, gradually, progressively build, on the things that we do.
Assuming from year one to year two that now you're starting to get a feel for the calendar, right? Of, hey, I know we got to have this in by by such in practice, and I know we got to have this done, because in year one, I can only imagine that you're like, all right, I got all this stuff. We're going to try to get all this stuff in, and man, trying to figure out how long it's going to take to be able to install this or that. And now I'm sure you're getting I'm sure you're getting a better feel for it now.
Yeah, for sure. I'm just thinking about like the mistakes that I made in year one versus year two. A lot of that was, okay, you might think of a drill or see a drill that you want to do, but you're not thinking about how long it's going to take to teach them. And then, okay, you got to account for it may not be perfect the first time you run it. So they may make some mistakes. So a 10-minute drill can easily turn into a 20-minute drill. And then that 20-minute drill can easily turn into a 30-minute segment. And now you spent 30 minutes doing something that you only planned on doing for 10 minutes. And you feel like, oh man, now my whole plan is thrown off. There's been plenty of times where we're doing certain drills or we're in certain segments of practice and it's taking a little longer than I expected. And now the whole plan is thrown off. But I've gotten better as a coach and my staff has helped me with staying the course, right? Okay, we may be off track a little bit, but what are the most important things that we still want to hit on this plan? So those are things that I, try to make sure that I have on the plan. What are things that we absolutely must do today? And those are the things that, okay, if we don't do anything else, we got to do these things.
It's that fine line, right? So you have some coaches that they've got their practice plan and this drill's 10 minutes, this drill's 12 minutes, this drill's 8 minutes, whatever. And you get to 10 minutes and some coaches are like, boom, we're moving on. It doesn't matter where we're at in the drill. 10 minutes, we're gone. And then there's other coaches who are like, no, we're going to stick with this until we get it right. It sounds like you're kind of in the middle of those two where, yeah, maybe if we got to go a couple extra minutes to figure this out, we're good. But then I got to make some adjustments moving on in the practice plan.
Yeah, for sure. And that also, it depends on what time of year we're in too. If we're in January, like if we're in the thick of it, like we're in the middle of the season, okay, we might have only planned for this defensive drill to be 15 minutes or this defensive segment to be 15 minutes, but we're about to play a team that shoots the lights out of the ball. So we have to stay in this. Like it doesn't matter what else we have planned. We have to make sure that we have this, down and ready to go. So.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. All right. So I asked you about how you plan the practice. Now I want to ask you about after practice. How do you reflect on how practice went? And then I guess, again, then preparing for the next one. So when a practice ends, what are you doing to kind of sit down and self-reflect and look at, okay, well, how'd that practice go? Hey, I like this drill, or man, I found this drill and we just did it. Man, that thing's terrible. We're never using that again. Just what's the process for looking back at what you just did in practice to kind of get yourself moving forward?
Definitely for me, I work and coach in a county where we have a system called Huddle. Not sure if you're familiar with that, but
for sure, absolutely.
I'll turn the Huddle camera on for practice, so we record practices, not every single one because we just don't have the time to, give to, watch and all of that. But if I do have the time, especially those early season, those foundational practices, those are definitely the ones that we're recording and not just for me, myself, but, I'll sit down with some players and I'll say, when we were doing this drill, why weren't you going so hard? Or, why, just really just, self-reflecting, but also just figuring out, well, okay, this didn't look that good in practice. So maybe maybe instead of 5 minutes, we need to spend 15 on this, really cleaning it up and making sure everybody understands and knows what they're doing, So a lot of self-reflecting comes from just, film watching, really.
You like to have a set plan for practice. I shouldn't say plan, a set routine, a set schedule where like we're going to start out with defense, or we're going to start out with a shooting drill, and then, or does it vary day to day just depending on the needs of your team?
So this year I did something different and my players responded to it well. So I think I'm going to kind of, do it moving forward. And, coaches feel free to, do this as well. When we finally developed our pregame routine, every game, we have 20 minutes before we get on the floor. So we have a routine of drills that we go through and, that became our pre-practice routine. So getting later into the season around January, and then getting into the playoffs, our pre-game routine became our pre-practice routine. So the first 20 minutes of practice, we're doing all our pre-game drills, and that's offense, defense, just touching all of, both sides of the game. So if let's say we have 2 hours of practice, if we spend 20 minutes doing our pregame routine, now we have an hour and 40 minutes of doing anything we want, basketball related. So that became like a thing that we did, later in the season. And it allowed us to spend more time doing other things to stay prepared for, our opponents or, just skill development, getting shots up, ball handling, skill work, all that kind of stuff.
Also a mindset thing, right? So they know as they go through that routine, they're getting ready for a game or they're getting ready for practice. They're getting ready. I can see the value in that 100%, that it just takes kids, especially, I think people forget, right? And it's this way in college to some degree, but it's even more so in high school, where you have kids who their class day ends. You talked earlier about the kid who comes in with their head down or whatever, and maybe he's a little bit, had something going on. Maybe they had a tough test or the girlfriend broke up with them or whatever. Yeah. And so to be able to kind of have that transition time, right? To go from, okay, here's something that we do every day. We're still attention to detail. We're still doing all those things, but it's familiar. Kids know that this is what's coming. And then that helps them to kind of shift from, hey, I'm in my day as a high school student, to now I'm here, I'm a basketball player and I'm getting into the practice. I'm sure it helps from that standpoint too.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And again, like we mentioned, working in the building, seeing the kids, some of the kids and, being a teacher, I'm in some of their classes, so like actually seeing what they go through before they get to the court, is definitely important.
What are some things that when you took over as the varsity head coach that you didn't realize that varsity coaches had to do outside of the basketball responsibilities? Because I think that's one of the things that, and I know that I spent like 12 years as a varsity assistant coach. And by the time I was done being a varsity assistant coach, I was like, I'm not sure I ever want to be a varsity head coach when I look at all the stuff that my head coach had to do. So just give somebody out there who's getting into coaching, who maybe is a young assistant coach and is thinking, hey, someday I want to be in the varsity coach at that level. What are a few things that you have to do to manage your program, to make sure that the program's running on all cylinders, that has nothing to do with on the court coaching basketball?
That is a great question. And I'll give you what I feel is the best piece of advice that the former coach gave me, because, when I came into this role, me and him, we have a good relationship. So we talk, and, the more than anything else that he told me, the biggest thing that sticks with me is, no matter what happens with this program, good or bad, your name is the first name that they're going to think of. Your name is the name of this program. So you have to be comfortable with whatever decision you make, knowing that whether it's a good decision or a bad decision, you're going to be looked at as the person that made the decision. So that's something that I really think about when I'm making decisions, right? Like, regardless if this is, something on the court or off the court, varsity or JV, and I think a lot of varsity or young coaches, don't realize when you're the varsity coach, you run the whole program. You're not just the varsity coach. The JV coach essentially reports to you. The JV players eventually are going to play for you. So you coach your team, yes, but you run the entire program. So, not just, the basketball side of things, but little things like fundraising, ordering uniforms. Like, we had a young man who unfortunately got like a bad cut during the game and he bled onto his jersey. We didn't have any backups at the time, so like little things like that, like just knowing just all of the things that you need. A lot of coaches take for granted and think that it's just basketball, but it's so much more, so much more.
That piece of advice that you got in terms of that your name is always on the decision brings to mind something that was one of our very first interviews, a guy he was a longtime head coach here in the Cleveland area. And I remember he told me that when he was making decisions about his program, he said that no matter what decision I make, someone out there is going to like it and someone out there is going to dislike it. It doesn't matter what the decision is. And he said, what I always came back to is when I put my head down on the pillow at night to go to sleep, I wanted to make the decision that I thought was right and not worry about an outside influence or not worry about what this parent was going to say or what this player was going to be upset, because I had to do what I thought was best for the program and the team. And as long as I made that decision, yeah, maybe somebody was going to be upset about it. But I always think that if you're doing your job correctly as a coach, if everybody's happy when you're a coach, then you're probably not doing a great job because you're not making the tough decisions that are required as a leader. And so that's a fine line to walk. And I think sometimes as a young coach, I know that I sometimes struggled with having those difficult conversations with whether it was players or parents, because sometimes you want to just kind of dance around the edges, right? You don't want to give them that harsh truth. But I think as you get older, you come to realize that you got to have the conversation and give them the harsh truth, because if you don't, you end up with this nebulous area of miscommunication, and then that's when your real problems can start. So I'm sure that sounds like that rings true for you. So to go along with that, I know I just kind of spouted on, didn't ask you a question. So let me ask you a question about parents. So tell me about how you, and I want to spin this positive, how do you engage parents in your program so that you have them as advocates for what you're doing instead of, in so many cases, we see the adversarial, right? We see the bad stories of the parent-coach relationship that goes south. So let's focus on the positive. What do you try to do to get the parents of your players engaged in your program so that when they're sitting in the stands, they're the people and saying, "Hey, man, Coach Ty, he's doing right by this program. He's doing right by my kid." How do you engage them in that way?
Well, to, speak to something that you just mentioned, with what you were just talking about, I think a lot of, coaches, they don't really consider how important connecting to the parents and just, really, engaging with them is. But I do think for me, I had a great coach, that I learned from outside of Julian when I was at the former school. And he used to tell the parents on parent night, like, very first night, right? Like he would lay the ground, he would lay the law, right? And he would essentially say, we have your son's best interest at heart. He had already been a coach and, in the area for, 15 plus years. So he also had the ability and kind of like the background to have these type of conversations with them. Like they were familiar with that.
For sure.
He would tell them early, like, this is not the type of program where, parents are going to be overly involved in decision making. So to the point that you were just making, like, he was comfortable he started with the harsh truth, right? He didn't dance around. He started with the harsh truth, and then we'll start to, build on that. But we're not going to dance around it. We're going to start with the harsh truth so that you know what you're getting yourself into, right? So that has always kind of been my philosophy. Like, I admire that because of the response and the respect that he got from that. I feel like parents, they appreciate when coaches are genuine with them, right? So I don't lie to parents. Like, if there's a child that's not that great, right, but the parent thinks that they're the next LeBron James, I don't mind being the person that has to tell them, like, you know what, dad and mom, like, let's ease on back a little bit with those expectations and those comparisons, right? Because at the end of the day, you shouldn't want your child to be the next anybody. You should want them to be the first them and the best version of them, right? So, that's what I encourage all of the parents with. Like, when you bring your child here to us and you allow us to coach them, it's a two-way thing. I'm not just telling you guys to trust us and just get out of the way. We have to trust you that you're going to believe in us and buy into the things that we're trying to do for your child, because we are trying to do right by your child and put them in the best position possible. You may not agree with everything that we do, obviously, because to your point earlier, if everybody's happy with what a coach is doing, there's too much people pleasing going on, right? And right, and you have to have those uncomfortable conversations. Now they don't have to be uncomfortable because it's not like the intent is negative. Like we're trying to positively, like you just said, when it comes to parents, like every conversation doesn't have to be oh, well, I feel like this and you feel like, and this, and it's a lot of clashing, right? It doesn't have to be a clashing conversation. We can agree to disagree, but at the end of the day, I'm thankful that I do have the opportunity where parents respect my decisions and they allow me to coach their children. And that relationship and that conversation is had early in the season. It's had throughout the season if need be, but thankfully, I've been in a situation where it hasn't had to happen consistently throughout the season. Hasn't had to be a lot of reiterating.
I think proactive is what I always like to say is you try to build that relationship so that it's positive, so that if you ever do get into a situation where you do have to have a conversation that maybe is a difficult one to tell somebody something that they may not want to hear, you're much better off with that conversation when you've already established a relationship with that
Absolutely.
parent. If the only time the parent hears from you is when they're complaining about playing time, and that's the first time the two of you have ever spoken, well, the odds of that going well probably aren't very high. But if you've already established a relationship and a conversation and a dialogue, and you're communicating with your parents on a regular basis, then when situations arise that maybe there is a disagreement, it makes that conversation easier to be had because there's already that previous relationship. I think I've found with the situations that I've personally been in and ones that I've seen with players and coaches that I know, that when there's a previous relationship, it just makes things go a lot smoother.
Oh yeah, for sure. And, fortunately for me, my assistant coach that helps me out, he went to school with some of the parents. So, just the timing of everything,
Yep.
they really trust us as a staff because they're familiar with a lot of the faces and a lot of the people that they see. So yeah, that's helpful as well.
Absolutely. All right. Before we get out, I want to ask you a final 2-part question. So
Sure.
part one is, when you look ahead over the next year or two, obviously you're a couple years into building the program. What do you see as being your biggest challenge over the next year or two? And then the second part of the question is, when you think about what you get to do every day, what brings you the most joy? So first, your biggest challenge. Second, your biggest joy.
Well, I mean, I'm just going to be honest and straightforward. I would say the biggest challenge is just the landscape of basketball is changing in terms of just players and their, willingness to stay committed to programs, on the public and private side of schools.
Absolutely.
You see a lot of movement. You see a lot of players, starting at one school, finishing at another school. So I would say my biggest challenge is, just figuring out how to navigate that space and, just making sure that I'm doing things at Wilde Lake that, players want to, be a part of and, just continue to, build a brand of, just hard nosed, hard working basketball players that, just appreciate the game. And that's something that I see as challenging. You have a lot of guys that are playing, and just chasing things that aren't necessarily, things that I would, play for. So just trying to, build that genuine love for the game back into a lot of my players, and that kind of goes into the second part, like that's joy. I think the biggest thing for me that I fell in love with as a coach, right? When you're teaching, X's and O's, when you see a kid have that, oh, that's what you mean. That's like, oh, yes, you get it, So those are definitely the best moments for me, seeing a kid, teaching a concept, seeing a kid figuring out and then going and applying it just brings joy to my heart for sure. So yeah.
That's awesome. I mean, I think any coach can relate to that moment, right? Because we've all been in that experience where a kid or a team, they don't get it. They don't get it. They don't get it. They can't get it. They're just struggling. And then all of a sudden, boom, they figure it out. And then the smile that came across your face when you told that story, man, like I recognize that smile from myself and from coaches that I know of, like, man, like all of a sudden they're figuring it out. Like that's what I've been teaching. And all of a sudden it goes from you've had this vision in your head of what your team or what that player is supposed to look like. And all of a sudden you're like, there it is, man. It's incredible. That's a great feeling.
That goes back to what you were saying earlier, just, figuring out and seeing the kids, when they have that moment, it's like, that's the vision that I had in my head when I first started, So
no question. No question. All right. Last thing before we finish, I want you to share, how can people reach out to you? How can they find out more about you and your program? So whether you want to share social media, email, website, whatever you feel comfortable with. And then after you do that,
sure,
I'll jump back in and wrap things up.
For sure. I'm very fortunate to be in the position that I'm in, working with these young men, because I'm not going to lie, like, there was a time in my life where social media wasn't really my thing. I wasn't really into, that world and that, that side of things. But people can find me. My main platform right now is Instagram. I'm Coach Ty Zero on Instagram. That's like my main platform. So I'm getting back out there on the social media side of things. If anybody wants to interact or connect with me, my email is coachty320@gmail.com. That's probably the best way to, reach me directly. Again, trying to build my network back up. I know like the younger generation, they love the TikToks and, the Instagram. So reels and all of that stuff. But I'm not really like I do tell people, I do pride myself on being a real life coach, right? So I may not be on Instagram, I may not be on TikTok, but you can find me in the gym, working with kids and, giving my knowledge to the game. So that's what I'm about. It may not be cameras around recording it and, posting it, but the work is there though, for sure.
That's well said, Ty. And I just want to thank you for taking the time out of your schedule tonight to join us. I really appreciate it. And to everyone out there, thanks for listening. And we will catch you on our next episode. Thanks. Your first impression is everything when applying for a new coaching job. A professional coaching portfolio is the tool that highlights your coaching achievements and philosophies, and most of all, helps separate you and your abilities from the other applicants. The Coaching Portfolio Guide is an instructional membership-based website that helps you develop a personalized portfolio. Each section of the Portfolio Guide provides detailed instructions on how to organize your portfolio in a professional manner. The guide also provides sample documents for each section of your portfolio that you can copy, modify, and add to your personal portfolio. As a Hoopheads Pod listener, you can get your Coaching Portfolio Guide for just $25. Visit coachingportfolioguide.com/hoopheads to learn more.
Thanks for listening to the Hoop Heads podcast, presented by Head Start Basketball.